They say some things in life can be replaced, but land? Land carries blood, memory, history. And when they took mine, they didn't just steal dirt. They stole my father's heartbeat. My name's Jack Carter. I wasn't born rich. I wasn't born lucky. But I was born on that land. 70 acres of wild green just outside Millstone, North Carolina. My dad used to say, "Jack, this land will outlive both of us. Treat it right, and it'll treat you right back." And I did. For 40 years, I kept that promise. I worked it through storms, droughts, winters so cold my hands cracked open. But every season, that land gave something back. Wheat, corn, peace. Until the summer the trucks came. I still remember the morning. July heat, sky clear as glass. I was fixing the gate down by the southern fence when I heard engines growling up the ridge. Heavy, rumbling, corporate kind of engines. When I looked up, I saw a line of white trucks rolling in, tires chewing through my grass like they owned it. They stopped near the old barn. Men jumped out, hard hats on, clipboards in hand. Not farmers, not neighbors. Outsiders. One of them walked straight up to me, smiling that fake business smile. "Morning, sir. You must be Mr. Carter. We're with Lakeside Development. Just here for a quick land survey before Phase 2 construction." "Phase 2? I frowned. "Phase what?" He looked at his clipboard, confident. "You've probably seen the new homes across the creek. Lakeside Meadows. Phase 2's just expanding across this parcel." "This parcel?" I said slowly. "You mean my land?" He blinked. According to county records, this area's been reclassified. It's part of the HOA residential expansion zone." I laughed. I actually laughed. Because it was so damn absurd. "My father bought this land in 1973, I said. "It's been Carter property ever since." But the man didn't flinch. He just nodded like he'd heard it all before. "You'll need to talk to the city, sir. We're just following plans." Plans. That word hit me wrong. Over the next few days, I called everyone. County clerk, zoning office, even the mayor's secretary. No one wanted to talk. No one wanted to help. It was like they all knew something I didn't. And when I finally got a meeting, the answer hit me like a punch to the chest. 2 years ago, during a boundary adjustment, 15 acres of my northern land had been rezoned as residential. Then sold, legally, on paper, to a development firm tied to the local HOA. I didn't sell it. I never signed anything. But somehow, the document said I did. And by the time I realized it, it was too late. The ink was dry. The permits were issued. They called it progress. I called it theft with paperwork. A month later, the bulldozers rolled in. They tore up my father's barn like it was garbage. They leveled the wheat fields. They hammered the ground where we used to sit and drink coffee at sunrise. They built 35 homes, all identical, all soulless, where my family's blood once ran deep. And the worst part, the HOA office was built right at the property line, like a crown planted on stolen soil. I tried fighting. Hired lawyers, sent letters, filed complaints. Nothing worked. The system didn't care about small men like me. The HOA had money, lawyers, power. I had my name, my land, and both were slipping away. By fall, my life had gone quiet. The sound of tractors was replaced by kids playing, dogs barking, sprinklers hissing over manicured lawns. People waved from porches they didn't earn. One evening, I walked to the edge of my property, where the land dipped toward the reservoir. My father and I had built that dam 40 years ago. It was simple, hand-packed, strong as stone. It held back the small lake we used for irrigation, clear, still, peaceful. That night, I stood there for hours, watching the moonlight shimmer on the surface, thinking, breathing, trying to calm the storm that wouldn't stop in my chest, because they thought they'd beaten me. They thought I was done, just an old man too tired to fight. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. They had their plans, and now I had mine. They thought they had closed the book on me. They thought the bulldozers and the signatures were the last lines. They were wrong. When the first law firm letter came, it read like a verdict. Professional, cold, full of phrases meant to bruise without blood. "We advise you to cease interference," it said. "Further action will be taken." That's lawyer speak for, stop asking questions. Stop making noise. Pay the price of silence. Noise was exactly what I intended to make. The first thing I did was simple, almost childish. I began to document everything. I drove the property lines with a camera and a recorder, narrating like a man telling his own eulogy, except I wasn't dead yet, and I wasn't finished. I recorded the survey stakes, the date stamps on invoices, the license plates of trucks. Every small detail became a thread. Every thread would be a line to pull. Next, I learned how to make people listen. It turns out stories travel faster than paperwork. They move through mouths, through feeds, across dinner tables. So I told my story to anyone who would sit at my kitchen table. I told it to the mail carrier. I told it to the teenage barista who made my coffee. I told it to the men who fixed my fence. I told it until my voice rasped, until the same words settled into other people's minds and wouldn't leave. Then I called a reporter. You don't call a reporter because you want glory. You call a reporter because you want an audience that outnumbers the people who profit from quiet. I called the county paper, the one that runs obituaries and school board minutes. I told them about the misfiled maps, about the barn that no longer stood, about the trees that were marked as convenient easements. I handed over copies of my father's deed, the blueprints, the old tax receipts. I gave them the kind of material that makes a dry desk reach for a headline. When the story ran, it wasn't sensational. It was honest, the kind of writing that shows the human cost behind a bureaucratic change. But honesty is slippery. It spreads. Friends of friends saw it. A local radio host called. Somebody uploaded a video of my testimony to a small community forum, and the clip caught like a match in dry grass. People began to talk. With attention came more than sympathy. It brought allies. An environmental group reached out, concerned about runoff into the creek. A law clinic at the state university offered to review my file pro bono. A retired surveyor, someone who had spent 60 years reading land like scripture, left a note on my porch one morning with a hand-drawn diagram that contradicted the developer's map. These were small salvations, but they mattered. The HOA got nervous. Their PR team sent out a statement that read like an apology without a conscience. We empathize with Mr. Carter's concerns and are committed to transparency. They scheduled a town hall, full of folding chairs and those limp plastic sandwiches developers roll out when they want to look accessible. I accepted the invitation, not because I wanted to play nice, but because the public square is a place where a man with proof can change the architecture of power. That meeting. I put the pieces on the table. I spoke plainly about water flow, about how grading without proper mitigation funnels stormwater faster and harder. I showed photographs of the dam, of the old stonework my father had built, of cracks that had appeared after trucks had driven heavy loads across a newly compacted grade. Experts, those who had once been strangers, explained the science. Hydrology isn't cinematic, but it's persuasive. You can call it dry, but a scientist's diagram can be terrifying to someone who lives in a house whose foundation is being questioned. By the time the night ended, something had shifted. People murmured. A woman in the front row who'd been silent all night came up to me with her hands shaking and said, "We had no idea." That one sentence was a lever. Once people know, they rarely prefer ignorance. I kept my pressure legal. I filed formal appeals, sent certified letters, demanded a full review of the permitting process. The law is sluggish and strange, and it rewards the patient who can show up with receipts. I learned to be patient in a way that felt like active warfare. Patience that involved forms, subpoenas, depositions. Paperwork became my battlefield. It's not flashy, but it's effective, and while the lawsuits crawled, I expanded the fight to the court of public opinion. I posted regular updates on a small blog, short, factual, personal. I shared old photos of the hayfields, of my father leaning on a fence, of our harvest festivals. People started sharing things back, an old neighbor's memory, a faded postcard, a child's drawing. Those little artifacts knit a narrative that made the maps look mean and arbitrary instead of inevitable. The developer, sensing the PR hazard, offered a settlement that looked generous enough to quiet some tongues, but came with strings. Non-disclosure clauses, waivers, a gag that smelled of cowardice. They wanted to pay to keep tidy. They wanted to soothe the optics without fixing the wrong. I refused. I had seen what silence bought them, and I wasn't selling my voice or my father's memory for a check. That refusal spun the machine faster. They ramped up legal pressure. They sent letters demanding I stop photographing their work. They posted security signs and hired private contractors to patrol areas I had once walked freely. It felt petty, and at times it felt like intimidation. But those moves made the pattern plain. When someone hides, they are often hiding something. So I adapted. Where proximity was denied, I used process. I filed public records requests for communications between the HOA and the county planning office. I requested contractor invoices, backdated permits, meeting minutes. These are bureaucratic artifacts. Ugly, dry, dense, but they tell stories if you know how to read them. And reading became my new obsession. One late November afternoon, a stack of emails landed in my lawyer's inbox. Leaked or misfiled. depending on how you want to call small miracles. They were a thread of messages between an HOA board member and a county planner, casual in tone but damning in content. "We can expedite approvals if we move quickly," one read. "Make sure the survey shows no conflicts." Another suggested sketchy solutions to drainage issues rather than real fixes. These emails were the kind of proof that makes hearts race. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were ordinary and honest. And that ordinary honesty revealed intent that I printed those emails and walked them down to the county office. I handed a copy to the reporter who had become a sort of reluctant ally. Once the emails hit the press, the reaction was immediate. Residents who'd been conciliatory became indignant. Online petitions gathered signatures like storms gather thunderheads. The county initiated an audit. The developer's stock, if they were public, would have felt the ripple. Instead, they got phone calls. Pressure, like water, finds its way through the ground. It seeps. It undermines. It softens what seems hard. And soon, the developer's smooth surfaces showed hairline cracks. Board members stopped returning calls. Contractors tightened lips. The HOA's statement of empathy looked thinner under scrutiny. At the same time, I never lost sight of the dam. People assume flood means only destruction, but my flood was different. I kept documenting the dam's condition. I commissioned an independent hydrologist to run real tests. I taught myself enough of the language of engineering to ask the right questions. When the report came back, it confirmed what my gut had suspected. The grading increased peak runoff by a significant percentage, meaning the pond behind my father's dam now faced higher load in storm events. It was technical, but it was devastating in its implications. Armed with data and public attention, I filed for an injunction to pause further move-ins and demand remediation of the drainage. The legal papers landed like a cold wind. Tonight, as I sit and tell you this, the court date looms like a decision carved in stone. The developer's legal team is sharpening their knives. The HOA is polishing their statements. Neighbors are talking in the grocery store aisles, some with fear, some with quiet approval that I didn't go looking for drama. Drama found a way into my life when I refused to be quiet. What began as an ordinary life of routine became a fight about who gets to write the map of a community. And as the court date approaches, as the reporters prepare their pieces, as the emails get printed and the petitions gather signatures, I can feel the tide changing. They built 35 pristine houses on the bones of my past. They thought that would be the last note. But I had patience, and I had process, and I had the stubborn kind of courage that keeps showing up day after day. Their move had been swift and noisy. My response was slow and irresistible. This is where it gets tighter, where the pressure builds until the thing breaks. The next segment will pull the thread until the seam opens. Legal knots tightened, allies galvanized, the public square noisy and unforgiving. When the dam holds, or when it doesn't, is not the point. The point is that the flood I intended was not one of ruin. It was a flood of truth. And truth, when given the space to move, will find the low places and fill them until there is nowhere left to hide. The thing about truth is it never knocks softly. It doesn't ask permission before it enters your life. It storms in, flips your table, and shows you what's been hiding under it all along. After the audit was announced, the silence from the HOA was deafening. For weeks, their trucks still rolled, their sprinklers still hissed, but the smiles were gone. The new homeowners, some innocent, some willfully blind, began to realize the land under their pristine driveways might not be as solid as they'd been promised. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. Did you hear Carter's suing the county? They say the land was stolen. What if our foundations aren't safe? Fear is contagious. It moves faster than truth, but when the two meet, the effect is nuclear. The local news picked it up next. One evening, I came home to find a white van parked at the gate. A woman with a microphone stepped out, followed by a cameraman balancing his lens like a rifle. She introduced herself as from Channel 7, Charlotte News. Her voice was sweet, polished, trained to sound empathetic while cutting right to the bone. "Mr. Carter, we'd like your statement on the HOA land dispute." For a second, I almost laughed. All that noise, all that pain, and now, finally, someone cared because it was good television. But I didn't waste a moment. I spoke clearly, calmly. I told them about my father, about the barn, about the land that was signed away while I was still paying taxes on it. That I didn't sound angry. I sounded tired. And that, somehow, hit harder that BY morning. The clip had gone viral across the county. The camera had caught something raw, the kind of emotion no PR statement could compete with. People saw a man who'd been wronged, who wasn't asking for pity, just justice. The next HOA board meeting was chaos. The community hall was packed. Angry homeowners shouted questions. One man waved a printout of the leaked emails. A woman demanded refunds. A board member tried to keep order, sweating through his suit as the crowd turned restless. And I just stood in the back, arms crossed. Watching the storm unfold, it wasn't revenge I felt. It was balance. The kind of balance that comes when truth finally tips the scale back where it belongs. But even balance comes with consequences. A few nights later, I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside my house. Headlights cut through my window, then a sharp bang on the door. I opened it to find two men in black jackets. Private security, the kind hired to intimidate, not protect. "Mr. Carter," one said, voice flat. "We'd appreciate if you stopped taking photos of the lakeside property. It's considered harassment." I didn't answer, just stared at him long enough for the silence to start working. Then I said, "You trespass on my land again, and I'll let the sheriff decide who's harassing who." They didn't reply, just left. But I knew this wasn't over, because when you start threatening a machine built on money and silence, the machine starts to grind. Days turned into weeks. Rain came heavier than usual that December. Long, steady rain that soaked through the hills, that made the creek swell and the ground soft underfoot. The developer's improved drainage system wasn't ready for it. Puddles grew into ponds. Water pressed against the cheap culverts they'd rushed to install. That I walked the boundary every morning, boots sinking into mud, watching the runoff gather near the edge of the old dam. It was holding, strong as ever, but it was angry, alive, pushing against the seams of time. There was something poetic about it. The land fighting back in the only language it knew: gravity, water, pressure. That week, I met again with my hydrologist. We reviewed the reports, the drainage maps, the soil density charts. The conclusion was clear. The HOA's grading had created a risk, not just to me, but to every family living in those 35 homes that I had evidence. I had momentum. I had the story. So I filed one last motion, an emergency injunction. It requested a full stop to all construction and a mandatory safety review of every new home built on that disputed soil. The county clerk stamped it at 9:42 a.m. I walked out of that office lighter than I'd felt in years. The court date was set for January 12th. And for the first time, the fight wasn't about survival anymore. It was about victory. But as the days crept closer, something shifted inside me. The anger that had fueled me for months began to settle. The noise in my head quieted. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't just about a legal battle. This was about legacy. About proving that one man's silence isn't the same as surrender. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I walked back to the dam again. The air was sharp, clean, the kind that tastes like winter and memory. I ran my hand along the cold stone, tracing the same grooves my father's hands once shaped. For a moment, I closed my eyes and saw it all. The barn, the wheat fields, the laughter that once filled this place. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. Not because I'd won yet, but because I finally understood something my father had always tried to teach me. You don't need to destroy something to make it right. Sometimes you just have to let nature, truth, and time do what they do best. And when they do, it's not revenge. It's justice. I turned to walk back home. Thunder rolled in the distance. A storm was coming. Maybe literal, maybe not. But one thing was certain. When it arrived, everyone in Lakeside Meadows would finally understand the lesson I had learned too late. You can build over a man's land. You can even try to bury his name, but you can't silence the ground that remembers him. They say time heals all wounds, but time doesn't heal when the wound keeps reopening, day after day. Every time you look out your window and see strangers living on what used to be your father's dream. January 12th. The court date. The day everything came full circle. The courthouse smelled like old wood and disinfectant. History trying to stay clean. My lawyer, a young guy named Ethan, sat beside me flipping through a folder that had become thicker than the Bible. He was smart, confident, but new to this kind of fight. I could see the nervous energy in his hands. Across the room, the HOA's legal team looked like they'd been born in suits. Polished, arrogant. 3 men and 1 woman, whispering behind stacks of binders that probably cost more than my pickup truck. The judge entered, a gray-haired man with eyes that could melt steel. The gavel came down. The noise snapped through the room like a rifle shot. And then, the battle began. Their lawyer stood first. Smooth voice, rehearsed tone. "Your Honor, this case is built on emotional confusion. Mr. Carter, while sympathetic, has no legal standing regarding the rezoning of the northern parcel. All procedures were followed. I whispered under my breath. Ethan squeezed my arm lightly, a silent, "Not yet." Then it was our turn. Ethan stood, buttoned his jacket, and began speaking with the kind of calm that cuts deeper than shouting. He laid out the documents, the flawed maps, the clerical error, the emails suggesting collusion. Every piece of evidence landed like a brick on the HOA's clean table, but it wasn't the documents that moved the room. It was the photos on the screen behind us. We showed the old pictures. My father hammering the first post in the barn, the family picnics by the lake, the early mornings with fog curling over the fields. Then came the images of what replaced it. Asphalt, fences, uniform houses, the barn's ruins, and no one spoke for a full 30 seconds. Even the HOA lawyers looked down for a moment, like they couldn't meet the eyes of the past. Ethan's voice was steady when he said, "Your Honor, this isn't about nostalgia. It's about the process that allowed one man's home to be treated as expendable. It's about what happens when those with money use silence as a weapon." The judge leaned back, thoughtful. He didn't say a word, just nodded once and asked for a recess. Outside the courthouse, the air felt heavy, like the whole town was holding its breath. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions I didn't answer. The story had grown beyond me now. It wasn't just one man versus an HOA. It was every small landowner who'd ever been told their home didn't matter. That night, it rained again, harder than before. Sheets of water pounding the tin roof of my house like a war drum. The storm drains near the development overflowed. The streets gleamed under lightning like mirrors cracked in half. I stood at the window, watching the runoff flow down toward the reservoir, toward the dam. For years, that dam had been quiet, just doing its job. But nature doesn't forget, and neither does the truth. Around midnight, the phone rang. It was the sheriff. His voice carried that clipped, urgent tone men use when they're trying not to sound afraid. "Jack, we've got flooding near Lakeside Meadows. The retention system's failing. Water's moving faster than expected. You might want to get down here." I grabbed my coat and keys. When I reached the ridge, red and blue lights flashed against the rain. Deputies waded through ankle-deep water, shouting orders. Flashlights cut through the dark like swords. And there it was, the water roaring through a half-built culvert, tearing across the cheap grating like it was made of paper. The developer's so-called drainage plan had collapsed under its own arrogance. The dam, though, still stood, old, weathered, unbreakable. I walked down to it, boots sinking into mud, and for a second, all I could do was stare. That dam had outlasted every lie they'd built on top of my life. It had survived storms, droughts, and now greed. Behind me, one of the homeowners shouted, panicked, "What do we do? The water's rising." I turned. "You do what I've been telling them to do for 2 years," I said. "You respect the land. You listen." Lightning split the sky. For one brief second, everything was pure white. The houses, the water, my hands on that old stone wall. And in that flash, I understood. The flood had never been about vengeance. It was about truth. About showing what happens when you ignore what's real for too long. Because water, like truth, always finds its way through the cracks. That as dawn broke, the rain slowed. The creek swelled but didn't burst. The homes, some flooded, some spared, stood quiet under a gray sky. The world looked humbled, washed clean in a way words could never do. And I, standing there drenched in mud and memory, felt something like peace. Not triumph, not revenge, just peace. Because the world had finally seen what I'd been trying to show them all along. The land remembers. And sooner or later, it speaks back. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Local TV stations called it the flood that spoke truth. Reporters lined up at the courthouse. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Cardeland. Hashtag HOA storm. Hashtag justice for the farmer. But to me, none of that mattered. What mattered was that, finally, the ground had told my story for me. Ethan called at 7 a.m. "Jack," he said, voice shaking with something between excitement and disbelief. "The county's emergency board just held a meeting. They're calling it a failure in approved infrastructure. They're ordering a full investigation into the HOA's construction permits." For a second, I couldn't speak. I just stared out the window, watching the mist roll off the lake. "Jack, they're reopening your case," he said. Those words hit harder than any verdict ever could. For months I'd fought to be heard. For years, I'd been dismissed as the angry landowner who couldn't move on. Now, suddenly, they wanted to listen. I drove into town that afternoon. Everywhere I went, People recognized me at the diner. The waitress set down my coffee and said quietly, "My dad lost land to them too. We're all rooting for you." At the hardware store, an old man clapped my shoulder and muttered, "About damn time someone stood up to those HOA crooks." It felt strange. The same people who once avoided me now looked at me like some kind of symbol. But I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to make things right. When the hearing resumed a week later, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every row. Even the HOA's lawyers looked tired. The kind of tired you get when your lies start catching up. The judge entered, holding a folder that seemed heavier than before. He looked at me, then at the board members sitting opposite. "I've reviewed the new evidence," he said. "The county inspection reports, the internal emails, and the structural maps. It appears there were, indeed, multiple procedural violations in the rezoning and construction process." He paused. You could feel every heartbeat in that room. Therefore, the judge continued, "The court hereby rules in favor of Mr. Carter. The transfer of the northern parcel is nullified. The HOA and its development partners are to cease operations immediately pending federal review." Gasps filled the room. Cameras clicked. Someone whispered, "He did it." But I didn't cheer, didn't smile. I just exhaled, slow, heavy, years worth of breath I didn't even know I'd been holding. The HOA's attorney tried to protest, his words cracking like glass. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this ruling could cost millions." The judge cut him off. "Then perhaps you should have respected the millions that didn't belong to you." That line, it echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Afterward, outside on the courthouse steps, microphones swarmed like bees. Reporters fired questions. "Jack, how does it feel to finally win? Do you have plans for the land? What do you want to say to the homeowners?" I stood there, soaked in flashbulbs and rainwater, and said only one thing. I never wanted revenge. I wanted remembrance. And now the land remembers me again. It wasn't the kind of quote that makes headlines, but it was the truth. That night, I drove back home. The rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet pine and quiet redemption. The lights from the half-finished houses still glowed across the lake. Empty, hollow, waiting. I parked by the dam and sat there for a long time. The moon's reflection shimmered across the water, broken only by the ripples of wind. I thought about my father, about how he used to say, "Land isn't just dirt, son. It's memory. You care for it, it'll care for you." He'd been right all along. The next morning, the county trucks arrived. Engineers, surveyors, cleanup crews. They began inspecting every house, every pipe, every false promise that had been poured into that soil. The HOA board resigned one by one, their fancy signs taken down from the gates. The new homeowners? Most of them moved out within months. Some stayed, quiet and ashamed. But I didn't hate them. They were just caught in someone else's greed. And me? I didn't rebuild right away. I let the land breathe. Let it dry, heal. Remember that I planted grass again. Put up a small wooden fence like the one my father built 50 years ago. Simple, honest, real. Ethan stopped by once, standing beside me as I hammered the last post in. He said, "You know, you could sell this land now for 10 times what it was worth." I smiled. "Then it wouldn't be mine anymore, would it?" He laughed softly, shook his head. "You really are old school, Jack." "Maybe," I said, "but old school built things that lasted." For a long time, we just stood there in silence. The kind of silence that feels full instead of emptied. As the sun went down, the light caught on the surface of the water, turning it gold. The dam still stood, scarred but strong, like me. And for the first time in years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, the story was finally done. Or maybe it was only beginning. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from courts or headlines. Sometimes it comes from standing your ground, until the world has no choice but to see you. They say every storm eventually runs out of rain. But what they don't tell you is, when the rain stops, you start to hear what was always there underneath the thunder. Silence. Real, heavy silence. The kind that feels like truth. Months passed after the court ruling. The land began to heal in ways I couldn't describe. Grass pushing through the cracks. Birds nesting in the old oak again. The sound of water moving calm, gentle, alive. That I spent my mornings by the dam. Same spot every day. Sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing but the wind. The town had changed too. People waved again. Some stopped by just to talk. Farmers, workers, even a few of the homeowners who stayed behind. One of them, a young guy named Rick, came one afternoon with his daughter. She wanted to see where the flood man lives, he said, half smiling. But I laughed. "I'm not a flood man," I said. "Just a man who listened when nobody else would." The little girl looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. Did you really make the water talk? Her question caught me off guard. I looked at the dam, the lake, the hills, everything that had once been taken, now quietly breathing again. No, I said softly. The land talked. I just stopped trying to silence it. She nodded like she understood something even adults forget, that sometimes nature says what we can't. After they left, I sat there long after sunset. Fireflies blinked across the grass, the same way they used to when I was a kid. The house was quiet. The world, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like it was against me. But there was still one thing left undone. I went into the shed that night and found the old wooden sign, faded, cracked, nearly falling apart. It read, Carter Land, EST 1954. My father built that sign himself. For decades, it stood by the road until the developers ripped it out. I spent the next 2 days sanding, staining, and sealing it. Every brushstroke felt like patching a wound I'd carried for years. When it was ready, I carried it back to the edge of the road, the same dirt where it had once stood, hammered it in point one. Nail. At. A. Time. The sound echoed through the hills. Each strike felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence I'd waited half my life to finish. When I stepped back and looked at it, something in me settled. Not pride, not even relief. Just peace. Because the truth is, revenge fades. But remembrance, that lasts forever. A week later, Channel 7 came back for a follow-up interview. The same reporter who once showed up looking for a story now stood there quietly, almost respectfully. Mr. Carter, she said, after everything you've been through, what have you learned from all this? I smiled, a real one this time, and looked straight into the camera. I learned that you can take a man's land, you can take his name off a map, but you can't erase the roots that hold the soil together. You can pave over memory, but it'll always find a way to rise back up. That's what land does. That's what truth does. She lowered the mic, eyes glassy. For a moment, even the cameraman didn't move. Just silence. When the piece aired that night, it wasn't titled The Flood Man. It was called The Land That Remembered, and it hit people differently. Not as drama, but as something deeper, a reminder that progress without respect is just destruction wearing a suit. In the weeks that followed, more stories came out. Other farmers, other families, speaking up about the same thing. The county changed its zoning review board. New laws passed about land seizure transparency. I never asked for any of that, but it felt right. Like justice had finally learned how to breathe. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the rain hitting the roof. And for a split second, I remember the storm, the fear, the noise, the chaos. But then I remember what came after, stillness, the kind that tells you it was all worth it. Now, every morning, I walk past that sign and run my hand along the carved letters, Carter Land. Not because I need to remember who I am, but because it reminds me what we stand on. The ground beneath our feet isn't just dirt, it's history. It's blood, it's story, and as long as it remembers us, we never truly lose anything. Oh yeah, maybe they built their homes, maybe they poured their concrete, but in the end, when the rains came, the land didn't betray me. It spoke for me. And when the flood rolled through, it didn't destroy. It cleansed. Because some stories aren't meant to be buried, that they're meant to rise. Like water, like truth, like memory that refuses to die.